Berlin, 1946. The city still smoldered. Rubble filled the streets where statues once stood, and the cold wind carried the scent of dust and ash through the hollow shells of theaters that had once echoed with Nazi anthems. One such building, the Ufa-Palast am Zoo, stood scarred but upright, its roof patched with tin, its marble floors cracked and gray. Inside, a different sound was awakening. A record needle dropped. The speakers crackled. Then a trumpet wailed, warm, alive, unrestrained. The tune was In the Mood by Glenn Miller, a sound the Reich had banned as degenerate. Yet now it filled the theater like sunlight through broken glass. German civilians crowded in the aisles, coats drawn tight, eyes wide. Some had never heard swing before. The syncopation, the laughter hidden in rhythm, the freedom in every note. Moments later, the lights dimmed again. The projector hummed to life, and an American movie flickered across the cracked wall. Casablanca. Humphrey Bogart's face appeared, cigarette smoke curling like a ghost through the beam of light. The audience sat transfixed. In that moment, amid ruin and silence, Germany witnessed something extraordinary. Not conquest by weapons, but by rhythm, laughter, and light. When the guns fell silent in May 1945, Germany lay in ruins, not only physically but spiritually. Its cities were craters of brick and smoke, its economy crippled, its people exhausted. The once mighty Third Reich had collapsed, leaving behind a shattered nation divided into occupation zones run by the Allied powers. To most civilians, the future seemed as gray as the rubble outside their windows. What had been promised as a 1,000-year empire had lasted just 12. What followed was silence, and into that silence came a sound Germany had not heard in years: American music. During the Nazi era, jazz, swing, and blues had been outlawed. Hitler's regime had labeled them Entartet Musik, degenerate music, unfit for the Aryan spirit. Saxophones and trumpets had been confiscated. Jazz clubs shut down. American records destroyed. To the Nazi mind, the improvisation and rhythm of jazz represented chaos and racial impurity. The people learned to fear not just ideas, but melodies. For over a decade, an entire generation grew up without hearing Louis Armstrong or Duke Ellington, without seeing the effortless grace of Fred Astaire, without knowing the sound of freedom in art. Then suddenly it all came back. As the American troops advanced across Germany in the final months of the war, they brought with them radios tuned to Armed Forces Network, gramophones, and boxes of vinyl records. Wherever they went, they filled the air with music: Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, Billie Holiday. In bombed-out towns, German civilians began to hear faint strains of swing drifting from military jeeps and makeshift canteens. It was unlike anything the propaganda of the Reich had prepared them for. The barbaric Americans, as the Nazi newspapers had called them, played music that was joyful, human, alive. It confused people, and it fascinated them. The U.S. military government quickly recognized the power of this cultural curiosity. In the months following surrender, occupation policy shifted from punishment to re-education. The plan was simple yet revolutionary: to defeat Nazism not only by law, but by culture, to replace the rhythms of marching boots with the rhythms of jazz. Under the Information Control Division, ICD, American officials began reopening theaters and cinemas that had once hosted Nazi propaganda films. Instead of Triumph of the Will, these screens now showed Gone with the Wind and the Philadelphia Story. Instead of oaths of loyalty to the Führer, audiences heard dialogue about love, morality, and choice. To many Germans it was overwhelming. They entered theaters expecting lectures or Allied newsreels, but what they found was laughter. American laughter. For people who had known nothing but fear and obedience, the emotional freedom of these films was disorienting. They were seeing for the first time a world where defiance could be heroic, where humor could coexist with hardship, and where individuality was celebrated rather than crushed. Meanwhile, the sound of jazz became a kind of unofficial anthem of liberation. In Allied broadcasting centers, programs like Voice of America and Jazz Hour reached millions of listeners through crackling radios hidden in the ruins. Late at night, families huddled around speakers hearing the trumpet lines of Miles Davis and the velvet voice of Ella Fitzgerald. Some wept. Others tapped their feet quietly, afraid their neighbors might report them. Yet across the nation, a cultural thaw had begun. In Leipzig, a former SS propaganda hall was converted into a freedom theater. In Munich, the Americans staged open-air concerts with swing orchestras performing before crowds of thousands. The music was loud, undisciplined, and gloriously alive, everything the Nazi regime had tried to erase. It became, unintentionally, the soundtrack of a new Germany being born from rubble. In every note there was irony. The same people who had been taught to despise American decadence now found salvation in it. For some, the rhythm of jazz represented defeat. For others, it was the first sign of life after moral death. And in that tension between shame and discovery, a new chapter of German identity began. By late 1946, what began as a cautious experiment in cultural re-education had grown into a deliberate nationwide campaign. The American military government saw the arts not as entertainment but as medicine, a psychological cure for a population indoctrinated by years of propaganda. General Lucius D. Clay, head of the U.S. occupation zone, called it democracy through rhythm. The idea was simple: to rebuild trust and freedom not by lectures or leaflets but by experience, by letting Germans feel liberty through sound, image, and story. American information centers began to spring up in major cities. These were part library, part cinema, part community hall. Posters invited Germans to attend culture evenings where American films played to full houses. At first, attendance was hesitant. People feared being seen consuming the culture of the conqueror. But the fear faded quickly. Within months, theaters once reserved for Nazi speeches were filled nightly with laughter from Frank Capra comedies and applause for swing orchestras. The U.S. authorities selected films carefully. They wanted to show not victory but values. Movies like It's a Wonderful Life and Sergeant York offered lessons in individual conscience, sacrifice, and moral courage. They stood in sharp contrast to the rigid collectivism of Nazi cinema, where every story served the state. Now, for the first time in years, audiences were encouraged to think, to feel, to disagree. One German woman later wrote in her diary, "I came to see what the Americans wanted us to see. I left wanting to live as they lived, free." Jazz followed the same path. In Munich, the Americans reopened the Haus der Kunst, once a shrine to Hitler's vision of pure art, and hosted an exhibition titled Modern America. There, alongside photography and paintings, visitors found something far more subversive: a live swing band. The musicians were a mix of American soldiers and German youths who had secretly played jazz in underground clubs during the war. Together, they created a sound that was neither conqueror nor conquered, but something new. Audiences clapped awkwardly at first, then began to dance. For many, it was their first spontaneous public act in a decade. Not everyone approved. Conservative Germans saw the influx of American culture as moral corrosion. Some clergy warned that jazz and Hollywood represented a new kind of spiritual invasion. Soviet propaganda seized on this too, accusing the United States of turning Germany into a land of Coca-Cola and corruption. But the American administrators understood what was happening. For the first time since 1933, people were making their own choices about what to love, what to reject, and what to dream about. The cultural thaw was especially visible among the youth. Teenagers who had grown up under the Hitler Youth now formed swing clubs, informal gatherings where they played Duke Ellington records and practiced jitterbug steps. In Hamburg, young men slicked their hair back and wore American-style jackets, defying old uniforms with gestures of rhythm and rebellion. For them, jazz wasn't just music. It was identity. It represented everything their parents' generation had lost: individuality, expression, fun. Across Germany's American zone, abandoned propaganda theaters were transformed into freedom cinemas. The same stages that once echoed with Nazi rallies now screened Chaplin's The Great Dictator, where Hitler himself was mocked before a laughing crowd. It was an extraordinary reversal, the ghosts of tyranny exorcised by humor and art. By the end of 1947, American jazz and film had become not merely novelties, but instruments of transformation. What began as occupation had evolved into connection. German civilians, still rationing food and coal, queued for hours to watch Gene Kelly dance or to hear the Benny Goodman Sextet perform. These were not escapes from hardship. They were glimpses of a different future, one built not on obedience but on possibility. When American forces first landed, they brought tanks and rifles, but it was their trumpets and projectors that ultimately won hearts. The music of freedom was now echoing through the ruins of a nation once enslaved by silence. There were many layers to what unfolded inside those reopened theaters and concert halls. To the Americans, this was cultural diplomacy, a way to rebuild Germany not with sermons but with stories. To the Germans, it was something more personal, even painful. Every reel of film, every trumpet solo, forced them to confront what they had been denied. The irony was that they were not learning something new. They were rediscovering a piece of humanity that had been taken from them. For 12 years, Germany had lived under a regime that controlled sound itself. Every radio broadcast, every melody had to serve ideology. Silence was safer than expression. When that silence broke, the first reaction was disbelief. Civilians entered those makeshift cinemas timidly, as if stepping into forbidden ground. "We didn't know what to do when the Americans started the music," remembered one Berlin resident. "We just stood there, afraid it was a trick." Then someone clapped and everyone clapped. That applause was more than appreciation, it was release. People were remembering what freedom sounded like. Before 1945, American culture had been vilified as vulgar and corrupt. Jazz was Neger music. Hollywood was dismissed as Jewish decadence. Yet once exposed to it directly, Germans found these labels collapsing. The reality was vibrant, emotional, and strangely comforting. American culture, born of diversity and improvisation, stood in stark contrast to the rigid perfectionism of the Nazi ideal. It allowed mistakes, laughter, spontaneity, things that had been trained out of people's lives. A Leipzig theater worker described it simply, "Their films were full of flaws, and that made them honest." To the American administrators, music and movies were more than amusements. They were antidotes. They offered new symbols of heroism. No longer was strength defined by domination. It was defined by resilience, self-expression, and conscience. In Casablanca, German audiences saw a cynical man choose principle over profit. In Yankee Doodle Dandy, they saw patriotism expressed through song, not violence. These were quiet revolutions in perception. The soldiers on the ground understood it instinctively. While tanks had defeated the German army, it would take art to defeat its ideas. There was also shame in those audiences. Every melody of American jazz, every frame of Hollywood glamour, reminded people how much they had lost to fear and obedience. But there was healing in that too. Psychologists working with the occupation forces noted that cultural exposure acted as therapy. It offered an emotional vocabulary that had been suppressed. When audiences laughed at Charlie Chaplin or wept at the best years of our lives, they were relearning empathy, something propaganda had methodically drained. These theaters became, in a sense, confessionals without priests. The revival of American music also reignited German creativity. Many young musicians, long silenced or exiled, returned to their instruments. Local bands began forming around U.S. Army clubs, learning swing arrangements from soldiers and sheet music. By 1947, cities like Frankfurt and Stuttgart hosted their own jazz ensembles. A cultural exchange began. Americans brought the rhythm. Germans brought the precision. Together they created something fresh, post-war European jazz built on ruins but reaching for joy. Perhaps most striking was how these reopened spaces dissolved boundaries. Inside them, rank meant nothing. Officers and civilians, conquerors and conquered, sat side by side in the dark, watching the same screen. Shared laughter became a subtle form of reconciliation. It was no accident that many of the first mixed gatherings between Americans and Germans occurred in theaters. Culture did what politics could not. It made people equal again, if only for the length of a film reel. By the end of 1946, what had started as an occupation initiative had turned into something mutual. Germans no longer came to see American propaganda. They came to feel human again. And the Americans realized that their culture carried power not through superiority, but through sincerity. Every time a jazz note echoed through a theater once draped in swastikas, it declared a quiet victory, not of one nation over another, but of life over ideology. What military occupation could not easily achieve, jazz often did. Its informality and inclusiveness sent messages more persuasive than any speech. American cultural officers noticed that wherever swing bands played, conversations started. After concerts, local mayors and teachers approached GIs not with resentment, but with questions about education, about freedom, about how a democracy functioned day to day. For the Americans, this was soft power before the term existed. By letting people dance, they lowered the barriers that years of dictatorship had built. The strategy wasn't written in any manual, yet it worked. Under Nazi rule, women had been reduced to symbols. Mothers, homemakers, bearers of the nation. In the post-war years, the theaters reopened to them as citizens again. They came to dance halls and cinemas unescorted, laughing without fear. Hollywood heroines, Bette Davis, Ingrid Bergman, Katharine Hepburn, offered models of independence and wit that stood in radical contrast to the docility of Nazi cinema. Many German women later said those films changed how they viewed themselves. "We learned that a woman could speak, decide, and even disagree," recalled a young attendee of a 1946 screening of Now Voyager. That was more shocking to me than any bomb. For the young, born into Hitler Youth indoctrination, American culture was not only novelty but revelation. They were hungry for rhythm, color, and energy. Jazz became their rebellion, a safe way to challenge authority. American soldiers often gifted them instruments or records. Sometimes they played together in impromptu street concerts. These rubble kids, as the press called them, began to adopt new slang, new dances, and new ideals. The Allies worried briefly about excessive Americanization, but soon realized that the more these youths imitated America's culture, the less likely they were to fall for authoritarianism again. Germany's artists and scholars, long silenced or exiled, now faced a dilemma: how to rejoin a world that had moved on without them. American cultural programs offered them platforms, lectures, translations, film series. Theaters that once staged Nazi-approved dramas now hosted Tennessee Williams and Arthur Miller. For many German intellectuals, this was both humbling and inspiring. They saw that art could question rather than command. The historian Friedrich Meinecke later wrote, "We learned from America that culture lives not in obedience but in argument." It was perhaps the first intellectual reconciliation between the two nations. For ordinary Germans, embracing American music was complicated by conscience. They danced and laughed, yet part of them whispered that they didn't deserve it. But the Americans, surprisingly, encouraged it. Chaplains and morale officers told locals that enjoying a concert wasn't disrespectful to the past. It was part of healing. Jazz thus became not escapism, but penance of a different kind. It allowed people to celebrate life again without pretending the war hadn't happened. When Louis Armstrong's recordings reached Berlin radio in 1948, one listener wrote, "I did not dance to forget. I danced to forgive." As the 1940s closed, American and German musicians began collaborating more intentionally. The U.S. Army sponsored jazz workshops. German radio stations launched swing programs. The influence rippled outward, giving rise to the European cool jazz movement of the 1950s. Ironically, this fusion would later influence American artists in return. What began as occupation entertainment evolved into a global dialogue, art crossing borders that politics still argued over. Through these many lenses, political, gendered, generational, spiritual, the same story repeated itself. Freedom communicated through culture. Theaters that had once served ideology now served imagination. For a society emerging from moral ruin, that was more than recreation. It was rebirth. By 1948, the experiment's success was measurable not in propaganda leaflets distributed, but in records sold, tickets printed, and smiles captured in photographs of post-war dance halls. Jazz had become the new pulse of Reconstruction, and every film projector that flickered to life over the ruins whispered the same message: the light still works. The true turning point of this cultural transformation came in the spring of 1948. Germany was still rationing food and rebuilding roads, yet in cities like Frankfurt, Munich, and Berlin, crowds were lining up not for bread, but for tickets. The Allied High Command had approved a series of touring jazz concerts to commemorate the third anniversary of the end of the war. The venues were symbolic: former Nazi theaters, opera houses once reserved for party elites, now repurposed as halls of democratic art. The first major concert took place in Frankfurt's Alte Oper, its chandeliers still missing, the roof patched with tarpaulin. When the American military band began playing Duke Ellington's Take the A Train, the audience froze. Then, slowly, people began to tap their feet. Some clapped off beat, hesitant as if asking permission to feel joy again. But by the third song, the room was alive. not with military discipline but with something freer. A photographer captured the moment, German civilians standing on their chairs, cheering for an American trumpet solo inside a building once adorned with swastikas. This was more than entertainment. It was revelation. The Germans saw Americans not as conquerors, but as creators. The rhythm, the humor, the improvisation, it defied everything totalitarianism had taught them. Here was a kind of strength that didn't command obedience. It invited participation. The same week in Munich, another moment crystallized the change. The U.S. Information Service reopened the Residence Theater, where Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels had once staged ideological plays. Instead of speeches, the screen now flickered with Yankee Doodle Dandy. James Cagney's exuberant dancing drew laughter and gasps from the crowd. When the film ended, the audience stood and applauded the projector beam as if thanking the light itself. For American officials, this was the proof they had been waiting, forgotten that cultural rehabilitation could reach where politics could not. Reports from the Psychological Warfare Division described visible emotional renewal among attendees. One observer noted, "They are not learning democracy, they are living it, 2 hours at a time." Jazz clubs began to open outside the control of the military government, run by Germans themselves. The most famous was the Hot Club of Frankfurt, founded by students who salvaged instruments from war debris. The Americans occasionally performed there, but more often they simply listened. The music had become mutual. These events spread rapidly. In Hamburg, U.S. troops collaborated with local radio to launch Swing Time on Sunday, a live broadcast that reached millions. In Berlin, the Theater des Westens, once used for Nazi galas, hosted Jazz for Freedom, a concert attended by Allied generals and German civilians alike. The symbolism was unmistakable. The halls once echoing with speeches of hate now pulsed with notes of unity. The transformation extended beyond sound and sight. Cafes began to serve Coca-Cola and played jukeboxes imported through the Marshall Plan. Teenagers swapped ration coupons to buy records, and shopkeepers painted stars and stripes on their windows to attract American customers. Critics in Paris and Moscow mocked this Coca colonization, but inside Germany, it felt like resurrection. After years of rigid conformity, people were embracing imperfection, tapping fingers, snapping out of rhythm, daring to laugh in public again. One young journalist for the Frankfurter Rundschau summed it up. "We are learning that art is not obedience, but dialogue. The Americans have given us not their language, but their laughter." That laughter and the music that carried it became the heartbeat of a new Germany. The war had been won militarily in 1945, but it was spiritually won in these theaters, where light and melody replaced fear and silence. Every trumpet solo, every movie reel, was a small defiance against the ghosts of totalitarianism. As the final encore of that Frankfurt concert echoed into the night, an American sergeant turned to a German stagehand and said, "I guess this is what peace sounds like." The man nodded, eyes glistening, and replied softly, "Yes, and it's beautiful." By late 1948, the cultural shift that began in scattered theaters had evolved into a national phenomenon. The American military government no longer needed to organize screenings or concerts. German towns were doing it themselves. A new type of evening emerged, part concert, part social ritual, known as Amerikanischer Abend. Local bands played Glenn Miller and Benny Goodman. Newsreels showed Hollywood trailers. Soldiers and civilians danced side by side. What had started as curiosity had become participation. In Nuremberg, a city once synonymous with totalitarian spectacle, the transformation was especially striking. In the same municipal hall where Hitler's rallies had thundered, the U.S. Army hosted a jazz festival to mark Thanksgiving 1948. Thousands came, including entire families from surrounding villages. The headliner was the 7th Army Band, performing In the Mood. The applause was thunderous. A German teenager, who attended, later recalled, "It was as if the building was finally breathing the right air." Across occupied Germany, this new relationship between conqueror and conquered was reshaping minds. Theaters were no longer just about entertainment. They had become schools of democracy. The film reels that once glorified empire now celebrated individuality. When audiences watched It's a Wonderful Life, they saw a morality tale about kindness, choice, and the value of community. For many Germans, this was the first time they saw a hero who won not by force, but by compassion. Even the architecture began to tell the story. Theaters once stripped of art now displayed murals of musicians and dancers. Cafes played records openly. Posters for the Glenn Miller story and Meet Me in St. Louis hung beside those for Goethe plays, a symbol of two cultures learning to coexist. This was not an erasure of German identity, but a reawakening of it through the lens of freedom. American officials noticed something unexpected. Crime rates among civilians who regularly attended cultural events dropped sharply. Psychologists attributed it to collective reintegration. People who gathered to listen to jazz or watch films found shared experiences again, bridging divides that propaganda had deepened. Jazz became a form of therapy. Film became a mirror for moral recovery. Meanwhile, in Washington, reports from the Office of Military Government painted a clear picture. American culture had succeeded where leaflets and speeches failed. General Lucius D. Clay, the military governor, summarized it best. We brought food and security, but it was laughter and music that rebuilt their souls. In December 1948, one of the most symbolic moments occurred in Berlin. The city, still under siege during the airlift, was weary and divided. But inside the Titania Palast, one of the few surviving theaters in the U.S., Information Service organized a free screening of Casablanca. Thousands attended despite bomb damage and curfews. When the projector flickered to life, there was no sound but the hum of the machine. As Rick said, "Here's looking at you, kid." The audience broke into applause that lasted minutes. Outside, air raid sirens still wailed. Inside, they believed for 2 hours that the world was repairable. That night became legendary among both Germans and Americans. The screening symbolized everything the cultural mission had aimed for: a temporary sanctuary where art replaced ideology and compassion replaced conquest. In post-war diaries, some Germans later wrote that those nights in the theater were when the occupation ended in spirit, even if not on paper. By early 1949, jazz and film had become foundations of the new transatlantic relationship. When the Federal Republic of Germany was established later that year, its constitution included protections for freedom of expression and art, principles reaffirmed not in silence, but in the echo of swing and the shimmer of cinema light. The transformation was complete. Theaters that once amplified tyranny now amplified laughter. American GIs who had arrived with rifles left behind records, and the sound that lingered across the rubble of Europe was not the march of boots but the soft, syncopated rhythm of a liberated heartbeat. By 1949, the echoes of jazz and cinema had done something no occupation army could plan. They had humanized the conqueror. Across Germany, the memory of American tanks and bombers was being overwritten by the softer imprint of music, movies, and manners. Theaters that had been gutted by bombs or propaganda were now symbols of transformation. Each rebuilt marquee bearing the words U.S. Information Service Film Night became a quiet monument to a different kind of victory: cultural, moral, and deeply human. In the American sector of Berlin, U.S. officers observed a curious phenomenon. In surveys conducted by the Office of Military Government, over 70% of German respondents said their perception of Americans had changed because of cultural programs. The most cited reasons were music, films, and kindness. One report noted, "Where once the American was seen as an occupier, now he is seen as an example, energetic, humorous, approachable." This wasn't propaganda. It was perception reshaped through experience. Cafes that once whispered fear now hummed with saxophones. In Hamburg, the reopening of the Operettenhaus saw lines wrapping around the block. On its stage, Oklahoma, the quintessential American musical, played to a sold-out German audience. The optimism of its songs, "Oh, What a Beautiful Mornin'," carried meanings far beyond the prairie. For Germans emerging from years of darkness, it sounded like a promise of normalcy. Meanwhile, American and German collaborations flourished. Radio Frankfurt began airing Jazz Hour, a nightly program hosted by both a German announcer and a U.S. Army sergeant. Their playful banter became a symbol of reconciliation, Good evening, friends, it began each night, and let's remember, peace has a rhythm too. The U.S. saw this as a strategic success, but for Germans it was deeply personal. Many wrote letters to American soldiers thanking them not for rations but for records. One from Bremen read, "Your music gave us courage to feel again. The brass and drums were louder than our shame." Another from Leipzig said, "When we watched your films, we saw what freedom looks like. Not a speech, but a smile." The economic consequences were equally notable. Theaters became hubs of employment and reconstruction. By 1950, the film and music industries in West Germany were among the fastest-growing sectors. American distributors working through the Marshall Plan's cultural arm flooded the market with films, not only blockbusters but educational shorts and documentaries. They helped restart a local industry that had been destroyed under the Reich. In the process, Germany became a test ground for something larger, the use of popular culture as diplomacy. American leaders soon realized that jazz and cinema had achieved what speeches could not. They had made democracy desirable. The U.S. ambassador in Bonn famously remarked, "The Marshall Plan rebuilt factories. Jazz rebuilt hearts." But the transition wasn't universally welcomed. In Soviet-controlled East Germany, these same cultural imports were banned as imperialist distraction. Radios capable of tuning into the West were confiscated. Yet even there, forbidden swing recordings circulated in secret. Young people in Leipzig and Dresden risked arrest to listen to Louis Armstrong broadcasts. They called it listening to freedom. The contrast between the zones became stark. Where the West danced, the East marched. For the Americans stationed in Germany, it was also a personal transformation. Many GIs who had fought bitterly against the Wehrmacht now found themselves teaching English, organizing concerts, or sharing coffee with locals. One corporal wrote home to Ohio, "We dropped bombs on this town 3 years ago. Tonight I'm playing clarinet in its theater. Maybe that's what winning really means." The relationship that began over film reels and brass instruments was already shaping the future of Europe. When the Berlin airlift concluded, many Berliners said the roar of C-47 transport planes reminded them of Glenn Miller's music, the same harmony of engine and rhythm that had defined America's presence. The occupation was no longer just political. It was emotional, and in that emotional space, a former enemy became an ally. By the early 1950s, the story of Germany's cultural rebirth through American influence had become one of the most remarkable social transformations in modern history. The U.S. occupation was drawing to a close, yet the imprint it left was indelible. Theaters once blacked out by war now glowed with neon marquees. Dance halls echoed not with orders but with saxophones. And the children who had once hidden from air raids now queued for matinees of Singin' in the Rain. The shift extended far beyond the arts. It reshaped how Germans viewed modernity itself. The efficiency and optimism embedded in American pop culture, cars, diners, jukeboxes, musicals, and blended with German discipline and craftsmanship to form a new identity. Democratic, forward-looking, and culturally open. In schools, jazz clubs were used as case studies in freedom of expression. Teachers explained how improvisation was the musical equivalent of democracy. Each instrument equal, each player free to lead or follow. Economically, the alliance flourished. U.S. film companies invested heavily in West Germany, reopening studios and training local cinematographers. The Marshall Plan's cultural initiatives even sponsored exchanges between Hollywood and Munich's Bavaria studios. German directors began experimenting with narrative styles influenced by American cinema, dynamic, optimistic, human-centered. In 1951, Die Sünderin, The Sinner, premiered, sparking controversy but also signaling that German film was alive again, unafraid, reflective, liberated from state ideology. American jazz continued to ripple through postwar society. Clubs like Storyville in Frankfurt and Atlantic Bar in Berlin became hubs for young musicians who had grown up amid rubble, but now dreamed in rhythm. U.S. troops were still stationed nearby, and their instruments often mingled with those of locals. The jam sessions that followed were spontaneous diplomacy that needed no translation. By this time, a new generation of Germans was coming of age, the so-called Trümmerkinder, or rubble children. They had no memory of Goebbels' propaganda, only the images of Bogart and the sound of Benny Goodman. Their heroes were not generals but jazzmen. For them, America was not just a nation but a symbol, proof that progress could coexist with humanity. Washington recognized the magnitude of what had happened. In reports to Congress, U.S. officials referred to Germany as the first successful cultural reorientation of a defeated state through democratic means. The phrase re-education was quietly replaced by partnership. The success of this model directly inspired U.S. cultural diplomacy during the Cold War, from Radio Free Europe to Voice of America broadcasts. What had started with Glenn Miller records and 16mm projectors now became an international strategy. But for ordinary Germans, the change was more intimate. Families who once saw Americans as enemies now named their children Johnny and Mary. Couples danced to jazz in rebuilt cafes. A baker in Cologne renamed his shop Liberty Bread. Even churches began holding jazz masses, blending sacred hymns with swing in a powerful symbol of redemption. Not everyone approved. Some intellectuals warned that Germany was losing its cultural independence to what they called the Coca-Cola civilization. Yet most Germans dismissed these critiques. They understood something deeper, that embracing joy was not surrender. It was recovery. As one woman told a journalist in 1952, after so many years of shouting and marching, it feels good to simply listen and smile. By the time Elvis Presley arrived in Germany as a U.S. Army private in 1958, he was greeted not as a soldier, but as a cultural heir to that legacy. The groundwork laid by jazz and cinema had already transformed post-war perception. American art had become Germany's mirror, reflecting what freedom looked like when rebuilt from ruin. And though few of those early soldiers, musicians, or projectionists could have known it, their influence endured. The young audiences who once filled makeshift theaters would later become the artists, journalists, and politicians of a new democratic Germany, one that defined itself not by conquest, but by creativity. In the end, the jazz notes that filled those shattered halls carried more than melody. They carried forgiveness. And the flicker of American films across cracked plaster carried more than stories. They carried hope, laughter, and the gentle rediscovery of what it meant to be human. When historians look back at the ruins of 1945, they often count cities rebuilt, factories restored, and nations rearmed. But the quieter miracle was cultural, a transformation that could not be measured in tons of steel or miles of rail. It happened in the flicker of a projector, in the swing of a trumpet, in the shared laughter of audiences who had forgotten how to feel joy. For Germany, the sound of jazz and the glow of American cinema were more than entertainment. They were antidotes to silence. After years when every song had been a march and every screen a tool of propaganda, these new rhythms and stories reminded people that life could be spontaneous, imperfect, and free. Freedom was no longer an abstract political term. It was syncopation, improvisation, and laughter in the dark. In the grand story of the post-war world, this cultural bridge would become one of America's most enduring victories. It did not conquer through dominance but through invitation, through melody and light that asked, not demanded, to be shared. Theaters that once glorified empire now projected empathy. Music that had been banned as decadent became the soundtrack of a democratic rebirth. And in that exchange of film reels for propaganda posters, of trumpets for war drums, something remarkable took root. Two peoples who had faced each other across battlefields found common ground in rhythm, emotion, and imagination. Jazz became the language of reconciliation. Cinema became the dream of normalcy. When the lights finally came on after a film, when the last note of a jazz solo hung in the air, what remained was a new kind of peace, not imposed by treaties, but lived through everyday kindness and shared culture. The Americans left behind no monuments carved in stone, but melodies that could be whistled and scenes that could be remembered. In the end, the real reconstruction of Germany began not with cement or policy, but with the simple act of filling a ruined theater and letting the sound of freedom echo again.